Morning, everybody. Happy hump day and welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political correspondent, Amber, and also Dave Burke, who is going to be looking after her today. Hello, Amber. Welcome for joining us. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to launch a political group and put the word popular in the title and see if that makes it so. So, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the first appearance yesterday of King Charles after his announcement that he has cancer, shortly before he left Buckingham Palace in a helicopter for Sandringham, where he's going to be recovering from his treatment. Now, if you want to read reams of insight and analysis about that, there's plenty available in the Mirror today. But while that is going to affect the news agenda for quite a long time, I suspect, I want to talk about something else which has happened this morning. Now, on page 2 of the Mirror, there has launched a petition calling for everyone to have access to an NHS dentist. Now, Dave, it seems bizarre that in the 5th wealthiest nation in the world, and the one with the best known and the longest socialised healthcare system, we don't have that already. In fact, I'm pretty certain there would have been petitions about having NHS dentists back in 1948 when the NHS was launched. Why are we making this demand now?
Well, this has been a problem that's been stewing up for a long time, but we've now at the point where it's become so visible. I think we saw earlier on in this week, there were some absolutely awful looking pictures of people queuing around the block when a dental service in Bristol came into new hands. And, people were sort of up at the crack of dawn trying to register because it's just so difficult in some parts of the country to get registered as an NHS patient. And this is causing some real problems. I think I was reading some figures earlier. I think something like 30,000 children were admitted to A&E as a result of tooth decay, 70,000 adults, and that's just in a year. The fact that people aren't accessing this treatment and going up for their checkouts and so forth, largely because they can't get some appointments and can't afford to go private.
So that's 100,000 people in total in a year, a third of them children, actually being admitted to A&E with tooth decay. So this isn't just someone who's gone, I can't get a dentist, can you fix my filling? This is someone whose problem is so bad that now they have to go to A&E with it. It's because of the pain, because of infection, because of they've tried to do something at home with it perhaps and it hasn't worked. And there's 100,000 people whose dental problems are so bad that it's become an emergency.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's, we hear some real horror stories about people that are resorting to doing their own work on the teeth, getting their friends to do work on the teeth. And obviously that raises the risk of secondary infection and sort of what could be easily solvable problems if you had access to a dentist, then escalating into something even worse. So we're seeing this isn't just something that affects the dental service, as important as that is. This is something that has a knock-on effect across the entire health service. I think I'm right in saying that tooth decay was the biggest cause of hospital admissions for 5 to 17-year-olds, or the biggest primary cause of hospital admissions for 5 to 17-year-olds last year. This is a real big problem.
It's shocking, isn't it? It's really bad. And the knock-on cost of that, it must cost more to have to care for someone in hospital with tooth decay when it's got really bad, rather than just sort of do the preventative work first. Now, what do you think, everybody? Have you been in that queue in Bristol? Have you had to queue somewhere else to have a dentist? Have you had problems finding a dentist? Have you had to pull your own teeth or something? Have you found problems trying to get your child to a dentist? We've also seen this morning, though, there's been a government announcement about reforms to the dentist system. Hooray! That's fixed it, hasn't it, Dave?
Well, there's certainly some good steps in this, but I think it's fair to say the experts aren't pleased. The British Dental Association has savaged it. They say it's not going to halt an exodus from the profession. I think it's estimated. I think we've seen about 2,000 dentists leave the profession last year, but sort of largely because of the pressure they're facing, largely because of the funding arrangements. There's a need for a big influx of personnel to deal with this. And certainly they're of the view that the plans announced by the government just aren't going to handle this.
So what have they actually announced then? Because there's been some stuff, hasn't there, about Labour has said that they were going to encourage toothbrushing lessons and stuff in schools. But it's, that's one of the things the Tories have nicked. This is, of course, why Labour is not announcing its policies, because they get nicked if they do. But what else is it that the government say they're going to do?
So they're ploughing about 200 million, they say, into trying to fix the dentist problems. I mean, certainly the British Medical Association will say this is a drop in the ocean compared to what's needed. They're looking at payments to dentists themselves. One of the big problems is that dentists are saying that the funding structure at the moment and the way that they treat patients, the money they receive as part of their NHS contracts doesn't take into account the amount of time it's taking. So there's a new patient payment that's being introduced by the government, somewhere between £15 and £50.
50 to do what? To see a patient? That sounds like it could be at the lower end of the scale is more likely to
I mean, I think under the current structure, I think dentists receive about £70 for doing fillings and so forth. But this is creating some big pressures because, like I say, it doesn't take into account the amount of time it takes to provide this treatment. And it's most dental services are balancing public and private. The service is funded on the basis that it's not going to be something that the entire population uses. There's an expectation from the government, and there has been historically, that a big proportion of the population will go private anyway.
Yeah.
But obviously we're in a cost of living crisis. We're this just isn't feasible for such a big proportion of the country, and the access to NHS dentistry that I think in some areas of the country there's nowhere that's accepting new NHS patients.
One of the things apparently that the government have announced today is they're going to be paying dentists, offering cash incentives basically. So they're going to pay dentists to see patients that they haven't seen for 2 years. At which point, of course, it's probably a bit late. But they're also going to offer them 20 grand to move to a part of the country where there's like a dentist desert, and therefore they could sign up there. But we've seen this week there's hundreds of people queuing around the block to sign up for that dentist in Bristol. The Mirror's been reporting on a day in the life of an average dentist, who's pointing out the contracts are so bad that they get paid exactly the same whether they do 1 filling or 20 fillings, even though the 20 fillings might take all day and cost far much more. So, the government or the opposition, are they going to do anything about the contracts system? Because that has it's been a mess really since the days that the NHS was formed in the 1940s, when the dentists all said, no, we want to stay private. We don't want to be part of this. So then therefore they were allowed to keep their private work, but have an NHS contract as well. And then the terms of that contract have obviously changed a lot over the years. They've agitated for one thing or another. The government has said we must do this, that, or the other. And so now you've got this kind of a system where it's not really an NHS dentist. It's a private dentist who's doing a bit of NHS contract work. And, because the NHS contract work isn't paying for itself, they have to do more private in order to keep the costs down for everyone, I suppose, to keep the practice going and to pay their insurance and all the rest of it. And we've also been now in this world where there's increasing kind of legal firms offering help for dental negligence and stuff like this. They get sued and their insurance costs go up and all the rest of it. Is there not an argument for just saying, do you know what? All the dentists just come into the NHS?
Well, I think this is the thing. I mean, we seem to be at a tipping point now. The contracts that we've got at the moment aren't working for anyone because the cost of using even NHS services, I mean, it's not a free universal service. And that will put off people even sort of from using NHS services. And the contracts, like we say, aren't working for dentists. We're seeing this mass exodus for various reasons. And there's no incentive for dentists to take on this work when the amount, like you say, a day spent doing various fillings for someone just won't pay for itself.
No. And if someone hasn't seen a dentist maybe for 2 years and got a lot of very complex problems as a result, it'll take a day in total perhaps to give them all the treatment they need. And that's the day you're not seeing the other 50 patients who you should have seen that day. Rick says it'll save the NHS in the long run if you give dentists all the places now. Well, you'd have thought so, wouldn't you? But it just seems to have been just not sorted at all. It's an absolute mess. Ian says, how about more dental hospitals? Set them up in existing NHS hospitals. Is that an idea? Has Labour said that this is what they'll do if they come to power?
Well, Labour have committed to providing more appointments. They say that they're going to offer incentives for new dentists to work in areas with the greatest need. They've obviously, like you say, committed to the supervised toothbrushing, and they want to shift the focus to prevention. But no, I mean, they're not proposing the kind of big overhaul on that scale either.
Is that because they really don't want to, do you think? Or is it because, as we saw with the toothbrushing thing, whatever they announce, the government's going to nick if it's too far out from the election? So although people like our viewer there just is interested in that, and I could see that a dental clinic in hospitals is something that most people go, oh yes please, that's a good idea. The emergencies for when you've suddenly got a crown fall out, when when something's super expensive, you go to your perhaps your private dentist even for checkups, but you have an A&E for dentists, I suppose. Maybe they're leaving that kind of thing till later, or is it something they're just never going to do?
I mean, there's so many policy areas at the moment. I mean, we would expect this to be fleshed out closer to the election. We know at the moment that they're very reluctant to do anything that would come with cost. And I think the reality is that the cost of overhauling the dentist system would come with absolutely enormous cost. There would, I'd imagine, be very strong resistance from dental services to moving fully into the NHS unless there's sort of they're compensated on a similar level to what they are going private.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's worth pointing out that there was resistance from doctors when the NHS was formed, and now they work in the NHS, and there's not an awful lot of concern that they shouldn't be. It's part of when it becomes the system. It obviously does work better in many ways. Just because someone's resistant to change doesn't mean that you shouldn't change.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this, from someone that takes a step back, I think this is inevitably the route that we have to go down. I think the current system of trying to get the balance right just isn't working. It's, sort of there needs to be a point, like you say, of being able to, in some areas of the country, if you get a really urgent issue with your teeth, you could be waiting days, weeks, or you might not be able to get an appointment at all, in which case you move to more drastic more drastic methods. Or you're turning up at an NHS A&E unit with something that you're not necessarily going to be able to find the staff that are equipped to deal with it.
No, and the impact that's had on your life in the meantime, of course, is infinite as well. Can mean all kinds of things for you. We did see one thing in the diary of a dentist that we carried, I think earlier this week or last week, which was he points out he had a patient who needed a lot of work done, and he qualified as an NHS patient, and therefore he only had to pay £70 towards it, and the patient still went white when he was told he's got to find 70 quid. That is still a huge amount of money for someone who's living on a pension, someone who's on universal credit. It's only about 80 quid a week. What are you going to do? People don't go and get the treatment. I mean, those are the costs involved. It's as simple as that. It has to be sorted out. I'm sure we'll come back to this more, especially I think as we're running up to an election, because it's going to be a very big issue. It's going to be totemic. Now, the other big story, which I suspect is going to affect the news agenda for a while to come, was the launch yesterday of the new paramilitary wing of the Conservative Party. We've got a bit of video from it, and here it is.
We've been swimming against the tide when we're talking about Conservative values. Whether it's what's going on in our schools and the fact that wokeism seems to be on the curriculum, and in our universities and in our corporate sector, there seems to be confusion about basic biological issues like what is a woman.
Good God, she's back. She's back and she's still talking rubbish. And I can almost see there once or twice she was kind of pausing for laughs, like in the pork market special. Then she was stopping herself and trying to say the next bit. Now, Dave, you were there. You went to this launch yesterday of the pop cons, as they're being called, the popular Conservatives. Tell us what happened. What was it like?
Well, this was the launch of yet another faction of the Conservative Party. There, we heard various speakers. Jacob Rees-Mogg was up. I mean, he gave quite the rant about various things, including the Supreme Court and the Rwanda decision. We heard a lot of politicians blaming effectively civil servants, quangos, people like this, saying that although we've got the will, we're being scuppered. I mean, which is an incredible flex after 14 years of power. We heard Lee Anderson saying that only when he's outdoor knocking with people, only the odd weirdo brings up green issues and net zero. And obviously,
claimed that coal was sustainable, didn't he? At one point,
he did. Yeah, I mean, it was quite the science lesson for us. It was.
Yeah, because coal comes from trees, so therefore it's an environmental fuel. God.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's. Yeah,
if
it was
you're watching, Lee, coal came from when the entire planet was covered by the rainforest or ocean and everything. There was therefore huge amounts of trees and ferns and animal life that managed to sink to the bottom, then got subsumed into the Earth's crust, subjected to massive heat and pressure, and could be found again 100 million years later to release the power of the sun and the warmth in a fire, right? But that in itself then polluted the planet. And unfortunately, between then and now, in the 100 million years since the coal was formed, we no longer have the kind of space or the kind of resources that would be making enough coal every week, for more coal. It's gone, mate. Gone. Not sustainable. Sorry, Dave. Carry on.
No, you're absolutely right. So we heard from him and his thoughts on net zero, which is obviously something that we're seeing more resistance from on the Tory right. We saw a Tory rising star, an election candidate called Myri Fraser. She aimed her gun straight at Rishi Sunak and said that the smoking ban that he's planning on bringing in, this rule whereby current 14-year-olds will never legally be able to buy tobacco. She branded it ludicrous. This is something that Liz Truss has also said she intends to vote against. She's going to be an interesting character. She's the candidate in Epsom and Ewell, and she's sort of previously described Donald Trump as incredibly refreshing. And I think we're
like a big drink of bleach.
Yeah, I mean, she'll certainly fit into that wing of the party. So so we saw her, and then obviously we saw the speech from Liz Truss. I think we're going to see her for years and years and years trying to explain to us how the 49 days of chaos, the increased mortgage fee, all the issues that we're seeing now as a result of what she did in that mini budget were everyone's fault but her own. She's made it very clear that she thinks that the orthodoxy within the civil service, within the financial institutions, held her back, and that actually she had great ideas. It was everyone else's fault that that none of this worked.
Yeah, Rachel says her saying that supporting LGBT people is a bad thing. It's absolutely disgusting. We had a comment, I think it was from someone called Lynn, about she's got a cheek. She was useless. Lynette, there you go. Wow, she's got a cheek. Aaron says, Liz Truss, the poor man's Maggie Thatcher. I don't think she's even Maggie. I think Maggie would just be speechless at what Liz was doing.
Well, I think the awful thing about this, I mean, we know from the polling, certainly the figures that came out earlier this week, we know that she's got a poll rating of negative 54. That compares against Rishi Sunak, who's on minus 27. She's incredibly unpopular with the public, who will always hold what happened against her. But she still retains a base. I mean, when she came up on the stage and when she walked into the room, there were huge cheers in the room, as there were at Tory Party conference when she gave us.
Were there people who were paid to cheer or were there for some other reason? I mean, it's kind of astonishing. She's, as you say, she's the least popular politician in living memory. She blame what happened in her 49 days on the city or economics or other things, but you really can't blame trans people for what happened to people's mortgages. She's just...
No, and I think this is the really dangerous thing. I mean, I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the election. It's the Tory right know that this culture war nonsense is going to play well with the party membership. Not with the wider public, I don't think, but we certainly saw during the leadership race with Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss that you could rely at some point on her saying, and I know a woman is a woman, and then pausing for the applause, which she would get from, the sort of harder right members of the Tory party themselves, who are quite a long way right of the wider population.
Yeah, exactly. This is the problem, isn't it? The Conservatives has. Rachel says Maggie did at least believe in climate change, although she was still awful. The fact that Liz, she's far less popular than Rishi, who everybody hates apart from his wife and his helicopter pilot. She hasn't gone quietly, has she, since this sort of disastrous 49-day reign of terror that she had last year before last?
Yeah, 2022.
Before last, 2022. Oh God, it seems like only last week. In fact, she's popped up again and again. So she's been visiting the neocons in Washington, for example. She's now leading this political faction in a party that's already got about 1,000 different factions. Do you think, is this a genuine new thrust for the Tories, which is going to define the party for its shape and its policies sort of into and beyond the next general election? Or is this just like a completely deluded Liz Truss and cronies who think if they call themselves popular Conservatives that it will somehow make it so?
Well, I think she knows. I mean, she's won a leadership election. I mean, in terms of running for the leadership again, or certainly, we all know she's a spent force. I think were the Tories to decide that they were going to give her another shot, I think the public would not be forgiving at all.
I think the public would just move.
I find it absolutely incredible. I mean, she's very much like, me personally, if I make a mistake, I'm absolutely mortified by it. And you feel, sort of struggle to make eye contact with people and so forth. I mean, you feel absolutely ashamed, and the absolute brazenness of Liz Truss, who's literally added hundreds of pounds onto people's mortgages every single month with her absolute incompetence. She nearly crashed, sort of a big part of the pensions market. She, the damage she caused was absolutely incredible. And now she's back brazen as you get and, not taking any sort of responsibility for it. But I think it's interesting. I mean, there were a lot of high profile Tories, not just among those speaking, but sort of in the audience as well. We saw Dame Priti Patel there, who will inevitably, I think, be involved when there's a leadership contest come the next election. And I think that's going to be incredibly ugly. I mean, I think we're going to see then just how divided the Tory party is. And bear in mind, to put in context, the launch of the Popular Conservatives, so-called, are joining an already very crowded field of groups on the right of the Tory party. I mean, we heard a lot about the five families, as they were dubbed, during the Rwanda votes. So there's already sort of 5 different groups of hard right Tories who want to see lower taxes. They want to see a harder policy on immigration. They're very much leaning into the culture war issues that, I think we're going to hear more and more about, and hopefully Labour will take a more moral stand against.
Yeah.
There
are some people in those groups who are in more than one group. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg was European Research Group, as well as them.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot of overlap.
Some of them are very split within their own heads, aren't they?
Well, I think the strange thing about this is I was speaking to quite a lot of people while I was there, because the thing I was really curious about is where does this group fit in and why is there a need for it? Because for a Tory MP on the right of the party who wants a group of like-minded MPs to join against, particularly those that are getting increasingly hostile to Rishi Sunak, they're already very well served for groups that they could potentially join up to. Like you say, there's the European Research Group, the ERG, there's Conservative Growth Group, there's Northern Research Group, there's New Conservatives who have only sprung up in the last year. Certainly, though, there were people from those groups. Certainly, Lee Anderson's been very involved in the past in the New Conservatives. So there is, like you say, a lot of overlap between the two. But where this popular conservatism fits into that, strange new ecosystem on the right of the party remains to be seen, and how influential they'll be in terms of, sort of who they're going to draw in, whether they're going to cause problems down the line for, sort of when it comes to drawing up a manifesto.
That's it, because they're going to be seeking to influence policy and so on, aren't they? Now, Rachel says not just a couple of £100 on her mortgage, £1,000 on my mortgage, thanks to Liz. I know someone who's had a couple of thousand put on their mortgage every month. It was pretty horrific, people to have to deal with. Now, there was another spectre at yesterday's fairly ugly feast, which was Nigel Farage, right?
Yes.
The former UKIP leader, now pretend journalist, who turned up, didn't ask a single question, of course, and was arguably more popular than Liz because he was getting stopped for selfies every 5 seconds, apparently. Dave, what was he doing there? Because he left the Tories 30 years ago.
Well, I mean, he said in advance he was there in his capacity as a journalist for a right-wing news channel. He's very much, he's very much visible. I mean, he knows that a lot of this is being pitched for him. The Tories know that if they can bring him into the fold, there's rewards to be had from doing it. He made the point afterwards. He said that he liked a lot of what he'd heard from the stage, but he also knows that that Rishi Sunak, who will ultimately be responsible for drawing up the next manifesto, isn't going to provide this. So, I mean, I think Nigel Farage poses a very big problem for the Tories, because they know that if they'll be desperate to try and keep him on side. I mean, the best case scenario for Sunak and co would be to draw him back into the Tory fold, because they know that if he were to sort of get more visible, stand for a seat potentially. I know he said he's not going to do it because he wants to be more involved in the US elections. But if he were to stand for a seat, sort of take a more visible role leading Reform UK, for example, that's a real big split on the Tory voters, especially knowing that a lot of the Tory membership is a long way right of the general public.
Yeah.
And knowing that even within there'd be a big risk of defections as well. Certainly some of the factions that we saw yesterday and that we see in groups like the New Conservatives. I'd imagine if they come forward and some of the policies on tax and immigration don't make it into the manifesto, I think there's a very strong chance that you'll have a lot of people that will sort of re-emerge very quickly as Reform UK candidates.
Yeah, perhaps some of those who've stood down and are going to as Tories. Andy says the Thunderbird puppets had better controlled hands than the Truss puppet, and a puppet she is. Now, quickly before we move on to good news, I want to just have a quick chat about this point that you made there about the Conservative Party and its base. So it's got a strong part of its roots, its activists, its party members, its MPs who are quite on the right of the party, who are very right in terms of they want tax cuts, they want business to have far more less regulation, I should say, far more freedoms, less regulation than perhaps most of the population do. And if Rishi is going to get re-elected or save as many of those MPs' jobs as possible if they lose the election, then he has to appeal to the broadest possible base, right? He cannot appeal just to this hard right kind of nugget of hardliners. He has to go broader, but he can't keep them happy if he goes broader. So he's got this fundamental, real big problem, isn't he? That he's got to try and appeal through a more extreme right-wing media that we've seen emerge in the last few years, a more extreme base that's come out, it's perhaps been radicalised a bit by Brexit and other issues. And yet a general population that is perhaps certainly more centrist and maybe even a little bit more left-wing in the wake of the pandemic. So how's he going to square that? How can he possibly?
Well, I think with a great deal of difficulty. I mean, the Tories, whoever was in charge at this stage, is going to be a victim of their own success in that in 2019, they saw so many places turn from Labour to Tories, some by very narrow majorities. But in many ways, it was a snap election called to try and finally break this Brexit deadlock. To sort of people being told that Boris Johnson had what he described as an oven-ready Brexit deal, albeit subsequently turned out to have a few issues with it.
Yeah, it wasn't a chicken and it was nowhere near the oven. But
no, yeah. I say this very generously to him because there's a whole other avenue we could go down at some length. But so we had a lot of people that were probably voting Tory for the first time, weren't necessarily likely to be long-term diehard Tory voters. But we saw this area down the red wall, places like Ashfield, where Lee Anderson won, where in normal circumstances wouldn't have previously in previous elections been a target Tory seat. Now, obviously, the pressure, now they've got these seats, is to try and retain them.
Yeah.
And, certainly there's one Tory MP, James Daly, who has a majority of 105. He was announced as Tory Deputy Party Chairman this week. Sort of very popular among the Tory right. But, places like this, it would be, in the normal run of things, would be hard to hold on to seats like this. Having now changed leader 2 times, got Rishi Sunak, who's sort of very unpopular with the public anyway for various reasons, and the general malaise where you see there's this sense now that everything's falling apart. We kind of feel like we're in the sort of 15th series of a Netflix series where sort of all the characters have kind of run their course. They're bringing back characters from the first series. Sort of everything just feels like it's kind of last days of Rome. Everything's falling apart type thing. I think there's a general sense of that through the population. So in terms of having a wider appeal, I mean, this is going to be very difficult for Rishi Sunak, because if he hasn't got a uniting issue like Brexit and trying to break that deadlock to try and sort of rally the country around. In the last election, Boris Johnson chose to call it for that reason, and he was able to package it and say, look, we can finally get Parliament moving again by doing this. I think, sort of where in any situation where Boris Johnson's still Prime Minister and things had run normally in the past few years, I think he would find it's difficult, albeit he'd probably have better control over the parliamentary party.
Yeah,
and
I think maybe it's going to get to the point where Rishi Sunak might go full Walter White, in the season finale, and just sort of end up burning the barn in the middle of nowhere, laughing his head off crazily.
I mean, I kind of think as well. I mean, who's he going to listen to? Because I think they've been a victim of the fact that they had this leadership race, and the way the Tory party is structured, it's the membership that choose who the leader is. And we saw that summer of them choosing the candidate that the wider public didn't necessarily want to. In terms of the parliamentary group that were very strongly in favour of Rishi Sunak. The party loved the promises that Liz Truss was making, albeit, sort of being told by, pretty much, by economists, by Rishi Sunak himself, how unfeasible what she was planning was. It transpired that this was true, but there's always the risk, as long as this system's in place, that the next time that there's a leadership race is going to go through exactly the same process with people who are very easily seduced by promises of tax cuts, sort of immigration. They know which buttons to press, and trying to square that with effectively leading a party is going to be very difficult for Rishi Sunak, let alone appealing to the public. It's when things just feel like they're going wrong on so many fronts. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I'm not Rishi Sunak yet again.
Well, yeah, exactly.
On Twitter, David says about dentists, their contracts were changed around 30 years ago because they were ripping off parents by doing fillings on kids whether they needed them or not. Don't know about that, but that's what David thinks. What goes around comes around, though the present rules are just as bad, but the other way around. We've also got Maximilian talking about Liz Truss. Why isn't this windbag behind bars? Well, she hasn't committed a crime, although she's definitely not very popular. Jonathan says on Twitter, she cannot take responsibility for her actions because she just doesn't get it. She's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Years ago, she'd have been in my class sitting at the round table with the trusty teaching assistant. Oh, dear. You go and sit on the round table with the teaching assistant. Thank you. That's a good one. Right, we have managed to find some good news in the world. And while I gather myself, let's run VT, please. Now, the People's Republic, South Yorkshire, is renowned for many, many things, but now it looks like we can add saving one of Africa's rarest creatures to the list. Yorkshire Wildlife Park in Doncaster has welcomed the birth of a new black rhino calf, which has yet to be named, but is the product of a global breeding program, which hopefully one day will see them reintroduced back to the wild to restore the population. Dave, is this proof that drinking Yorkshire tea, eating Warburton bread could be the way to save us all from extinction?
Well, I mean, fair play to the people at Yorkshire Wildlife Park. I mean, this is great news. And the little rhino, some of the pictures that we see of him, he looks so happy. It's I mean, this is great news. Obviously, a critically endangered species is it's very good news that there's
not just born into captivity, but born hopefully with a chance of freedom, which would be, to my mind at least, one of the best things. But I think fair play more to the mother, who's called Najuma, who endured 15 months of pregnancy, the poor woman. But I think that's fantastic. And maybe it is just Yorkshire tea. But so long as Liz Truss doesn't go there, because we really don't want her to keep coming back from the dead, please. Now, the calf hasn't been named yet. I'm sure the Wildlife Park is probably having some kind of a contest or is thinking about the name. Personally, my option would be call it Robin Hood, which is Doncaster's most famous son. There's nothing to do with nothing. It's Doncaster all along.
Coffee McCarface.
No. If we let, that's why they won't be having a vote. If you leave it up to the public,
they killed polls like this forever.
Yes, exactly. The path will be called Liz Truss and we can't be having that. Anyway, thank you, Dave, for taking us through all that. Thank you, Amber, for being well behaved. She only wriggled really badly, I noticed, when Lee Anderson was mentioned. She seemed to be quite disgusted and uncomfortable support the thought. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. If you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can find us. And we will see you all again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Until then, everybody, stay safe. See you on the other side. Tatty bye.